a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, dear writers and listeners. Well, we made it to the final week of August. Phew. I am Brooke Warner here with my co-host, of course, Grant Faulkner. Grant, I just want to say that we do get this little break from the podcast in August, which really just means that we get a break from interviews, but we've been busily lining up some interesting people. I did want to announce our excitement about particularly Roxane Gay coming on the show this fall. A big deal. I'm also super jazzed about Miriam Gurba and Elizabeth Crane, who you'll get to experience in September. Miriam is just a kick-ass literary star, and anyone who doesn't know who she is should definitely go check her out in preparation for the episode. Elizabeth Crane wrote this incredible memoir that I reference often. It's called This Story Will Change. And the reason that I like it so much is because it's largely written in the third person. So that's what I'm eager to ask her about, kind of an unusual point of view for memoir. And Grant, we are revisiting two amazing guests for our final best of, Carvell Wallace and Victoria Chang. I think both interviews were absolutely incredible. And I know that Carvell kind of changed your writing life a bit. So could you say more about why you were so touched by that episode and by him as a writer?
Yeah, I think of that interview and his memoir often. And it was really the culmination of talking with a lot of our authors on the podcast. I'm thinking of authors like Edwidge Danticat and Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, who both said that they wrote with love. And I just started wondering, what does that mean? And then Carvell Wallace's memoir is called Another Word for Love. And he defined love with the word struggle, which is, of course, like full of all sorts of stories. And he just defined it that way in such interesting ways. So it made me think about how we often take this powerful word, love, for granted and don't really think about its many meanings. So I've been thinking a lot about what that means. And I'm even teaching a week-long course on writing with love at the Omega Institute next summer. And who knows, maybe I'll write a book about it. The one thing I know is that our very unloving world could use more love in all forms now. And so, Brooke, I know Victoria Chang had a profound impact on you too. So it would be great to hear your take on her writing and why she's been such a powerful, influential, and inspiring voice in memoir in the past few years. I just love her writing.
Yeah, I found Victoria's forthcomingness about her shame to be very revelatory. Like for her, shame is just part of the landscape of her life, of her writing life. And rather than run away from that or even feel bad about it, she writes into it, she interrogates it. And I also find that there's such a powerful softness to her inquiry. She writes things that are hard, but her approach is very open and curious. And I find the way that she writes and speaks about things to be so moving and deep. I mean, she is a poet and also a memoir writer. And so she was definitely one of my favorite interviews this year. Grant, back in early August, we opened this series of our favorite episodes by talking about craft. Now we're going to close with craft because we've been letting listeners know that we have all these craft classes being lined up. We hope that those of you who came and joined us for Janet Fitch's class loved it as much as we did. And Carvell is coming up. And so if you listen to this and you think, wow, I would love to spend an hour with this guy, definitely check out his November class. And honestly, Carvell's book is such a powerful example of how to use theme as a cohesive force in your writing. And that is what he's teaching about because his book is about love in all of its permutations. This time of year comes with a feeling that I think we all know well, end of summer, heading back to school. And no matter how old you are, I think that back to school buzziness is kind of a felt sense. It comes from a felt place for me, for sure. And it can be very motivational. It can result in more writing and it can open space. It can open inspiration. Grant, I'm curious if this time of year has that effect on you. Do you seize on that energy for yourself? Are you a person who capitalizes on this good fall energy?
Definitely. I love the fall. It's true that, summer feels like a break of some sort, even when I'm working all the time. And I've been viewing September as a kind of new start date, and I'm even thinking, like this whole month with my memoir, I've been totally lagging for several months on it, actually. So it's kind of dormant. And I'm putting together a memoir writing group that's going to kick off in September. So yeah, there's something about September that's a milestone that seems almost as significant as January 1st, I think.
Yeah. And I think that fall is just more productive and creative in some ways than winter. And maybe it's part of the reason that I don't really love New Year's resolutions. I am impacted by weather and sun, as I mentioned earlier this month as well. Like I do suffer from SAD. I had shared about how god awful July was for me, how much you loved it, how hard it was for me. But that lifted in August. The weather definitely got better. But I do feel like the weather god stole half my summer, and fall in the Bay Area is gorgeous. September and October in particular are great months. And so I anticipate that I'll be in a creative bloom. I am conjuring that idea up for myself. I want to inspire myself to get back into my own memoir. Speaking of dormant, I have been on a 9-month hiatus, but it has been calling me. I very publicly said I'm going to wait till my son graduates from high school to publish the memoir. But guess what, folks? That is 4 years away. And I just realized we are acquiring books on She Writes 2 years out. So I was like, I really only have 2 years to finish the memoir if I want to publish it in 4 years. So that was kind of helpful, just a little perspective. I think I'm going to kick into gear this fall too.
All right. Well, that's the first time I've heard you mention your memoir in a long time. And I happen to know of a memoir writing group that I could make introductions to.
Awesome. I will look into that for sure. And hey, everybody, we hope that you enjoy this last August recap. Thank you for those of you who've been with us on this journey this August. And we hope that you've gotten something out of re-listening as we have. And we are excited to be back with you next week for some brand new, fresh fall episodes, kicking off our 8th season, as we've been saying. But before that happens, we are treating you to Carvell and Victoria. So first up is Carvell. We're so pleased to have Carvell Wallace with us. He is a writer and a podcaster who has contributed to The New Yorker, GQ, New York Times Magazine, Pitchfork, MTV News, and Al Jazeera. His debut memoir, Another Word for Love, explores his life, identity, and love through stories of family, friendship, and culture, and is a 2024 Kirkus Finalist in Nonfiction. Welcome, Carvell, and congratulations on this beautiful memoir.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Before we get to questions about the book, I want to take you back to before the memoir and some of the projects you were working on that led you on the path to getting here. You've done a lot of projects, including Finding Fred, which was an iHeartMedia documentary podcast about the life of Fred Rogers. And that was named a Best Podcast of 2019 by The Atlantic and nominated for a Peabody Award. I'm curious if there was a particular project which now, looking back, you think specifically opened the door to writing a memoir.
Oh, that's a great question. Wow. I think actually maybe the first one I think of is I did a podcast project with Al Jazeera in 2018, I want to say, maybe 17, called Closer Than They Appear. And that was a sort of memoiristic podcast about people confronting like America's past, present, and future. And I intertwined interviews with people with kind of stories from my own life. And that one also won an award. It won a Kaleidoscope Award from the Radio, Television, Digital News Association. And that was for an episode in which I went back to the town that I grew up in and did an episode with my best friend who was long estranged. Our lives went in totally different directions. He ended up becoming a drug dealer, getting shot, getting arrested, spending some time in prison, and was out now and was working as a chef. And he and I reconnected in our old neighborhood, which has been decimated by crack. Literally there's almost no houses occupied in the entire area.
Wow. And
he and I just kind of hung out on what used to be his front porch. His house is now collapsed. And we recorded an episode there. And I think in some ways that was maybe did as much as Finding Fred for me in terms of laying out a foundation about, how does one like approach the past as a way of dealing with the future?
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Carvell, Another Word for Love is about other ways of thinking about love, including violent ways and hurtful ways and just outside the box ways. And very curious about the seed of the idea for this book, whether there was a particular story you started with, or was it the theme and the paradox of love that acted as a kind of container for all your stories, or maybe something else entirely?
I think that, well, this is maybe an answer to the previous question too. I also wrote a piece in 2017. Maybe it was 2018, the website Medium asked a bunch of writers to write about the word of the year. And I wrote about the word trauma for that year. And it was not only because it was kind of like a buzzword in social media, but because I was thinking about it as a larger concept. And the idea that, trauma is and I write about this in the book, is a breaking apart of things that should be together. And then the attempt to recover from trauma is the attempt to bring things back together that have been rent asunder from one another. So as I say in the book, it's like you're a child and you and safety are one, you're together, and then something happens to split that and you spend the rest of your life trying to get back to that feeling of safety or that feeling of wholeness. You feel complete, and then trauma happens, violence happens, separation happens, and then you're separated from that feeling of wholeness and you're searching the rest of your life to get it. So I think that essay ended up being like a real seed for me to think about the way in which I wanted to write about, as I followed that idea through, it just seemed clear to me that the attempt to find and understand and practice love was an attempt to be reunited with what we had lost. And that love itself was a heavily misunderstood concept that was complex and layered and probably could benefit from long form examination. And so that's kind of what I tried to do in the book.
And well done. Also, I mean, it's this huge topic, and I was very taken by the paradoxes, and we're talking about contradictions. And I read in another interview about your awareness of the juxtaposition of beauty and horror, and that being something of a reality, a Black reality in this country, is what you said. And so I just wanted to draw attention to that word juxtaposition, also, paradox, contradiction, how human beings are so contradictory, how it's both and, how all things are true. And that's really what I felt when I was reading your book. And I'm curious to know if during the writing, did you ever worry that you were taking on too much in terms of the topic, and what kind of strategies did you have to contain the bigness of it all?
No, because I'm heavily delusional as a writer. I think almost you have to be. And so it never even dawned on me that this topic was too big, especially because I didn't feel compelled to come up with an exact authoritative text. Maybe if I was working in an academic context and I felt the need to kind of lay out the formal definition, and then maybe it would have felt overwhelming. But because I was working in a poetic, lyrical context, I felt like I could explore things in a way that was as loose or as tight as felt honest. I think I say in the beginning of the book, actually in the first chapter, that I've learned that a lot of things can be true at once, and this is how I have survived. That, that's in some ways one of the theses of the book, that this contradiction, this juxtaposition is a part of coming into harmony with life in the universe. I also think of that, and I'm not I can never remember if I think it might be Franz Fanon who said, and I only know this because someone told me, so I never actually read it, so I could be wrong. But someone said that there's a Fanon thesis that one of the ways we come into political awareness is through the experience of contradiction. And so it was important to me early in the book to establish the groundwork of contradiction, to be experiencing, and I talk about this, I think, both with the sun and with the snow, two natural elements that the snow is beautiful and silent and there's all these songs to it. But in this moment with my mother where we don't have a place to live, it's also a threatening, terrifying thing. And the same with the sun, living in LA and experiencing violence underneath kind of beautiful sunny skies, there's this contradiction. And that has always rang true to me, that the thing that awakens political awareness in a lot of people is when you experience a contradiction firsthand. This is supposed to be the land of the free, and yet I'm experiencing oppression. You know what I mean? Right. I'm supposed to be, I'm my religion tells me to be loving, and yet I experience and am surrounded by judgment and violence. And so that the experience of that contradiction is a key part to political awakening, or it can be. So I think that's what I was thinking about mostly as I was working through this.
That's fascinating. I love how nothing is just one thing, or nothing is just its surface. And you've said that you believe that no events exist, purely in the past, and that every event is linked in some way to myriad other events. And I think this speaks to your associative style of writing. So I was wondering if you would say a word about the structure of the book, which is divided into 4 parts. And did you have to cast around to find that structure, or just how did you land on it being right for this book?
Yeah, associative is a good word because that is the way that I write. And that way of approaching the text makes sense to me, or at least really did in this project, because of what you just said, that like it has to do with like the fact that no events are in the past or in the future. They all exist simultaneously. It's kind of a theory about time, about the passage of time, that time is not necessarily linear, that trauma particularly disrupts time. Trauma can make some moments last forever and other moments can disappear entirely because of trauma. And so as a writer, the associative style felt like appropriate to do this. But it's true that, you know, like when I think of like as an artist, I always think like there's the creation and then there's the curation. And so, you know, it's like I have to turn off the curative sort of critical brain in order to create. So I'm flowing, I'm like making connections, I'm describing flowers for 4 pages. I don't know where this is going. What am I doing? You know, but I have to let that process play out. And then at some point I have to come back into the work with like a different hat on. Okay, what are the themes? What's the structure? What is the order of things? So I would say for me about 40 to 50% of the way through the text, it then became like really important for me to go back and actually figure out what was the structure that I was exploring here. Like, what are the sections? What is the journey? How does one thing relate to another? And then once I had that, then it was time to like go back and sort of put everything in order, almost storyboarding it the way that you do when you're writing a screenplay. And then it was about filling in the connective tissue that was missing, you know, to get you along the journey that you've like now figured out is the journey of the book.
Well, it's kind of an amazing experience. Yeah, I love the associative style because there's the fluidity there. This next question I have is about violence and violation. I work with a lot of writers who struggle with this, obviously, how to do it well in memoir. And my experience of it was like a little bit like you were sneaking these moments in on the reader, like, bam, we're there and then we're out again. I'm curious if you could offer up your thoughts. I mean, you were just talking about writing trauma. I loved how you put it. Do you have advice to listeners who might be doing the same? And you know, what are your thoughts about this kind of sneak attack, if that's an okay way to put it?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I would say I have advice because I think every work sort of requires a different thing. I know that for me, I was interested in reflecting the way that violence feels, that it does sneak up on you. You know what I mean? That like things can be a certain way and then suddenly a violent action can happen and it's, in my experience, it's completely silent. There's no like background music. There's no dramatic score behind the violence. It just happens and then it's over and then you're just left with the sort of consequences of it. And so I wanted it to feel that way in the book. I also, maybe if I do have one like sort of writing theory about violence, it's that, you know, the more intensive the violence, the less writing you need to do, you know? I don't think I need to do a lot of like florid descriptions of violence. Like the writing takes care of itself. So for a lot of the more difficult parts, I wanted to get out as quickly as possible. And some of that may have to do with the fact that I'm writing about my own trauma and I don't want to spend a million years there editing and revising. But also because I just think that there's something that honors the reality of it, where you just say, this happened and it felt like this, and I have this one memory and this is what I saw. And then you move on from that. You let the story write itself in those moments.
Well, to contrast violence and violation, I want to ask you about writing about happiness. And Brooke and I were talking about this Salman Rushdie quote from an interview he did on Fresh Air. And he said that famously, it's been believed that happiness is almost impossible to write about. So I'm curious, do you think you succeeded in writing about happiness, or did you find happiness in your exploration of love?
Like a lot of people, I do not know what the word happiness means. Like it something about that word has never landed correctly for me, and I don't know what it is. I'm not trying to be like an emo like graduate student when I say that, but it's never. Maybe because it feels static, right? Like I'm happy, and it's like a period of, you know, and I don't think that happens. I think that what I try to write about is the struggle and attempt and effort to be connected and in love. And that struggle like has to be, you have to carry with yourself into that all of the things that stand in the way of it. I don't think, maybe the other thing about happiness is that it feels a little bit like it has to circumvent reality in order to exist. At least that's the way that I always think of it. And so that doesn't feel right. I feel like actually what we're looking for is a kind of contentment. I remember someone described once, I don't know if it's contentment or serenity, but described it as like not wanting anything that you don't have, or maybe even wanting everything that you have. And I feel like that's a mindset that takes practice to cultivate, right? Because there are a lot of things in my life that I'm like, I don't like that it's this way, but also there's a kind of acceptance that comes with, there's a practice of acceptance where you're like, but this is the way it is. And I have to be in some kind of, it doesn't mean that it has to be this way forever, but I accept that this is the way it is now. And I don't need things to be different right now because this is the way things are. There's a serenity or contentment that can happen in that moment. And I find that from that place, it is much more easy to be like, and so now we can address this. Now let's change this, because we're not operating from a place of panic or fear. We are accepting of what is, and we have a solid base from which to move forward to what should be, or what we would like, or what we hope for. And that's another contradiction that I think is like inherent in the process of like having a happy or content life.
So thank you for answering the question of why happiness is almost impossible to write about. now we know. That was beautiful. So self-exposure. Okay, self-exposure is on deck here. So I noticed that you thank Melissa Febos in your acknowledgments, and I recently hosted her for a memoir series where she was talking about pushing the envelope. And I feel like the baseline for memoir at this point has risen to a new level in terms of what's expected for memoirists to share. And that's really scary for memoirists. And then on the other hand, readers love it, kind of like the more raw, the more revelatory, the better. So how did you think about the scenes in your book that are the most self-exposing? And did you ever question putting certain things in the book, or, did you set out with a commitment to lay bare some of those experiences?
No, I definitely questioned putting some of those experiences forward. In fact, Melissa was one of the people that I reached out to be like, should I say this in the book? Like, what do you think? And she had great advice, unsurprisingly, which was, well, you can always write it and then see how it feels afterwards. But you should write it. And that struck me as like because I think you're right that there is this tortured relationship that the memoirist has with the audience, where we start to feel almost this invisible pressure, like everyone wants you to go raw, go deep, and it's in all these blurbs, it's always raw, unflinching, and like bared soul and stuff, and that becomes this kind of like brass ring that you shoot for because you think that's going to make everyone like you and give you awards and give you good reviews. But so in the process of writing, you can feel very pressured, or at least I can, to go there.
Yeah.
And I think what I found is that if that's the reason I'm doing it, because I hope that like someone in the New York Times uses the word unflinching, then not only is that not helpful to me, it's just not, the writing isn't going to be very good for me. For me, anything that's exposed, I mean, I learned this doing profiles, because sometimes I would do profiles and I would include like a portion of my life or some part of my story in the profile of the subject. And one of the things I learned in doing that is that, that's only useful if it shines light on the subject. But you are writing about what you're writing about. And in this case, I'm writing about life, love, trauma, and recovery. And so I only need to expose as much as is necessary to tell that story. But when I feel that an author is exposing just to be raw and unflinching, but it's not really in service of the story, to me, that's just not pleasurable writing to read. Maybe for other people it is, but for me, it's not. So I think that's how I thought about it. If it serves the story, I'm going to put it out there. But obviously, it's, memoir is an art of curation too, which I think a lot of people don't fully understand, because, you live, 15,000 days or whatever the number is, you can't write about every single day. So part of the artistry is the curation of like which days in memories do you talk about, and how do they coalesce to tell an overarching story?
Well, in closing, Carvell, one of my favorite parts about the book is you share this great story about Charles Mingus and how he would purposely write notes that were out of an instrument range. I think this is brilliant. And so his musicians would balk and say that there was no way they could hit those notes. And his response was, I know that, but the sound of you trying is what I'm going for. Mm. And you conclude, this is what words are, the sound of us trying. And I just love this as a kind of writing principle. I'm going to, mention this to my students when I teach, because it's such a beautiful maxim for writers. And I think it says a lot about how, in our writing, we strive for perfection, but we'll always fail to achieve that. It's always about the trying. Mm. So I was wondering if you could say more about what that line, what it means to you.
Yeah. I mean, like a lot of things in this book, that line or that kind of like use of concept is about two things, Part of it is about love, and that's in a chapter about the impossibility of love. That's a chapter that explores the fact that love is a struggle. It's a forever struggle to be closer to the person, to be better for them, to get them to be closer to you, to get them to be better for you. Like, you're constantly in this state of like trying to get closer to them, and you can never achieve that, because that's just, that is the kind of paradox of being in a human body. And I write about other paradoxes of being in a human body, that like we reach for the heavens, but we're tied to the earth. But there's a second thing in there, which is a lot of this book is about writing itself in its own way, and this is a line about writing, that like putting things into words. There's a reason we have music. There's a reason we have dance. There's a reason we have photographs and paintings, because some things can't be put into words. And yet, the attempt to put things into words and to find the words that either mean what you're trying to have them mean, or evoke what you're trying to have them mean, or somehow alchemistically create the thing you're trying to say, which without ever saying it, which is what poetry does. This is, I think, a beautiful pursuit, and it's an act of love and devotion to try and do that. So I think with that line, I was thinking about that the attempt to do things which can't be done is one of the facets of love, right? We do this with worship. We're trying to reach God. God is not there. Or is God there? No, God is not there. But is God there? Like, and like we're constantly trying to achieve things that can't be achieved, or maybe they can. And that's, I think there's a certain devotion to that, which I think is one of the words of love.
I love that.
I saw Grant taking notes, so I think we've achieved a new height here. Thank you, Carvell. That was gorgeous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carvell.
Yeah, I'm so happy to have done this.
Love that just as much this time around as last time around. He's just so good. Next up is Victoria Chang, who's also so good. So please enjoy.
Today we have Victoria Chang with us. Victoria's most recent book of poems is With My Back to the World, published in 2024. It received the Forward Prize in Poetry for Best Collection. Some of her other books include The Trees Witness Everything, Obit, and Dear Memory, Letters on Writing, Silence, and Grief. She has written several children's books as well, and she's received multiple fellowships and prizes, and is the Bourne Chair in Poetry at Georgia Tech and Director of Poetry at Tech. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. And I want to start with this body of work that's come out in the last several years. You published 4 books since 2020, starting with Obit in 2020, then Dear Memory in 2021, The Trees Witness Everything in 2022, and With My Back to the World in 2024. And I wondered if you could talk about the work and its interconnectivity. I saw an interview in which you described Obit as an offshoot of Dear Memory, or someone had characterized it that way. And I'd love to hear more about that, especially because Obit was first. And so how you think about your work in that way, like if you're collecting things, uncovering things, and, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Actually, someone, I can't remember who it was, once described Obit, The Trees Witness Everything, and also Dear Memory as a kind of a trilogy. Mm. And I've been thinking about that because they're all sort of dealing with similar themes of grief, and all were written sort of in a shorter period of time, and they all came out in a short period of time. And I think that's true. I think they're all related in some ways, because I think books are also, these arbitrary human-made objects. And I mean, your grief doesn't just stay in that book, if that makes sense. It doesn't just decide to stop when you finish writing Obit. And so I think, I think that's sort of how I think about it too now, once someone sort of mentioned that.
Well, and if I could ask you to follow up on this question of like how the work comes to you, because like Obit is done, and then is it the next book just starts to write itself and then it becomes the next thing? I'm just really curious about, like I was saying, is it that you're collecting new ideas or you have more to say on the topic?
I think with, Obit was really hard to write. And obviously the reception was really extraordinary to me. I didn't realize so many people would read it or connect with it. And the next book, I think, was Dear Memory. And, that just came out of an experience of finding a storage facility where my mother had, collected a lot of things. And so once I found that storage facility, I found all these papers and boxes of stuff. And I suddenly knew like all this information about my parents and then their relatives, people I never knew, like my grandparents' names and stuff like that. And so I was excited initially, but then, I had more questions. Like sometimes not having information is actually better. When you have too much, then you have more questions. But I didn't have anyone to ask those questions to. And that's how I started writing the epistolary lyric kind of essays. In Dear Memory, I started writing a letter to my mother. So the first one was Dear Mother, and I just kept on going. And then the Trees Witness Everything, I think I was just, looking to write some poems, but not have any ideas sort of ahead of time. So I just gave myself some fun things to play around with, like syllabic forms. And then also, those poems use W.S. Merwin's poem titles as their own. And so I just think I was in a very rich writing and creative period during that time. And I actually knew that I was in a rich creative period. And so I heard some people tell you and ask you all sorts of interesting questions. They use the word prolific a lot. And I just sort of ignored them all because I knew I was in a rich writing period and I was going to take advantage of that, if that makes sense. Like writing seizes you. And so what a gift to be seized. And I'm not in that period anymore. And I knew it would end. And so I was really happy to be in that period. And that's sort of when all those books were made.
Such an interesting way to think about the periods of our writing life. And we recently rebranded our podcast to be Memoir Nation, to focus on memoir. But of course, memoir these days is really morphing, and it encompasses a lot of things, including poetry and experimental memoir. And Dear Memory is categorized as a memoir. It's interesting to hear you refer to it more as like lyric essays, which I think is an interesting way in. And it's certainly experimental in that it takes the letter, the epistolary form, as you mentioned, and to your parents who aren't alive anymore, and to past teachers, and to your grandfather, and to old classmates, and even to silence. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the genre of memoir? And were you setting out to write memoir with Dear Memory, or just setting out to explore it and it took on a form that turned out not to be poetry? Or, I even wondered for a while if you would call it prose poetry.
Yeah. I mean, I think I love things that are uncategorizable or are multi-categorizable. Those kinds of things excite me because, I don't really think of myself as just a poet, but people call me a poet all the time. I think of myself as an artist or someone who makes things. And so I tend to kind of work across different, human-made genres. And so when I was starting to write those letters, I didn't really think about what they were. I knew they weren't poetry because they weren't quite concise enough, but I definitely knew that I was writing some kind of poetic prose. In terms of the memoir aspect, I think sometimes the word memoir can be considered like a dirty word kind of thing, especially amongst poets for some reason. But I knew I was writing autobiographical stories and asking those autobiographical questions. So I think you could probably classify most of my writing across poetry and Dear Memory, and even a lot of the children's books I write as memoir, if that makes sense. They're all stemming from my own experiences and my own perceptions of the world. They're just not sort of categorized that way. But absolutely, I think a lot of poets are writing memoir in their poems. I mean, their poems like that are all about their own life experiences and their perceptions.
Yeah, we completely agree. I think you could probably even apply that to fiction if you wanted to. I wanted to specifically ask you about your letter to silence in Dear Memory. It comes early in the book. You write this beautiful line that says, "I think I am circling around you, silence, your center. And the closer I get, the closer I am to shame, to the language of shame." This moved me, and I think it's moved a lot of people to think about the notion that silence is the language of shame. And I'm curious to know if you understood that to be the case before writing this letter, and, what did you understand or learn differently about silence and shame after you wrote that letter?
Yeah, I think, I think that whole book, and actually my writing process is very much so, for better or for worse, a process of discovery, even though it may not appear to be that way. People sometimes laudingly or disparagingly, kind of label some of my books project books, depending on what perspective or assumption they come at it with. But I think people might be surprised or not to think about my work as being, I'm learning along the way. And I think a lot of writers do that. I mean, you might come to, your paper or your laptop or whatever. For me, it's paper usually, unless it's prose, it's sometimes laptop. But, I think that I come to my writing, through kind of like this desire to investigate questions, nagging questions that I have. And so, to your question about silence, I mean, I didn't really know that's what I was doing until I probably wrote that letter. And then I was exploring that idea. And then it becomes a bigger and bigger idea throughout the book. So by the end, it literally becomes the theme in some ways, or one of the many themes of the book. And I didn't know that when I first started. I had no idea, especially with that book. I had no idea what I was doing. So I think of that book as being sort of like an X-ray. You could see a moving X-ray. You could see how things, are moving through the body. Like if you eat something, it's like you can actually see the object move its way through the body, because it's for me such a, an example of process as a book, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Victoria, you've shared openly about experiencing shame and embarrassment while writing. And I feel like people will look at someone with your level of success and maybe not imagine that's true, or believe you've gotten past it somehow. So I'm curious to know how you do push through when you feel that way when you're writing, and how do you come to terms with those feelings?
Yeah, I mean, shame is just sort of like a big part of my life. It's always been a part of my family culture, part of me. And, I think people can always tell, like some people who know these kinds of things are like, oh, you must have been totally bullied when you're growing up or something like that. Or they just kind of guess. And I was like, how did you know? And, I think, or you may have grown up with like a slightly more authoritarian parent. So people oftentimes, if they have those experiences or are familiar with those experiences, I think they kind of pinpoint those aspects of me. And I've sort of, it's odd because I feel shame all the time, but I've learned to kind of almost separate it from myself like an object. Like if I'm holding an apple, it's like the apple, it's not in me anymore. And so it's like, I experience that shame all the time, but in some ways I don't feel embarrassed about that shame. So I'm not shameful of that shame anymore, even though it's just a part of who I am. It's almost like built into my cells at this point. And so I actually think it's really important for writers to feel that sense of urgency when you're writing. Like the thing that you're writing about is so hard to actually get near that you might feel like if you get too close, like your eyebrows are going to get seared off. Like I think it's important to feel that sense of urgency, whether it's stemming from shame or fear, embarrassment, pain, trauma, joy, happiness, like I have no idea, but I think to me, you can I can tell, like, when something's written and it's, even if it's really this steely kind of like clean writing style, I can feel it. Like, I can feel that this was somehow important to the writer that was writing whatever they're writing. And if I don't even have that, it's pretty hard for me to kind of get, integrated into whatever it is I'm reading myself, because I don't feel like the writer cared that much about it.
Yeah, I've definitely had that experience. I know exactly what you're talking about, and touching into it is both important and hard at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Dear Memory, well, this kind of builds upon my last question, actually, because Dear Memory explores what you don't know. You just talked about that, like writing to explore the questions, writing into the unknown. But I was thinking about students I've had over the years who will tell me that they feel like they're casting around aimlessly, like they don't know what they're doing, they don't know where they're going. And you capture that with this quote from Donald Barthelme that said, "The writer is that person who, embarking upon her task, does not know what to do." So I'm curious, I mean, that's different than what you said, that you're sort of writing into the questions, but do you sometimes feel like you don't know what you're doing or casting around trying to find your way?
All the time. I mean, that's the fun of writing. If you knew what you were going to say and or how you're going to say it, then what's the point? That's not exciting. And so for me, I'm always, trying new things so I can really push myself and experiment with subject matter or genre or styles or form. I'm constantly interested in challenging myself, because to me, the whole writing process is the most important thing. Like, the book does not matter to me. It's just sort of manifests itself into a book. But I just really love the process of discovery, creativity, and writing. And you really cannot know ahead of time. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very enjoyable.
Victoria, in closing, you're known for writing about unspoken stories and cultural disconnection. And some of this stems from the immigrant experience, since many immigrants, hold their traumas close and historically have not, disclosed family secrets, perhaps to protect their children or to forget. And I wonder what you found in your exploration of silence to maybe be the positives that reside there, if there are positives. Seems to me that there's the hard part, which is feeling closer to shame the more you poke around in there, but that there must be a counter to this as well, beautiful aspects or gifts of silence that have made you the writer and person you are.
Oh, there's so many gifts. I think that I think about so many things all the time about like a different kind of childhood, and I think about my own kids and what a different kind of childhood that they have. And I really envy them sometimes, a lot, actually. But then I think to myself, oh, if I didn't have the kind of childhood that I had, where we didn't talk about anything, I didn't know anything. They're like, like what topic wasn't taboo kind of thing. I really feel like I wouldn't be the person that I am today. And I 100% would not maybe be a writer. Maybe I'd be doing something else, but it's almost like I wouldn't have any questions. I would just be a regular old, I call the rest of the world people who don't have these sort of desires to make things and artistically or have questions. I call them pedestrians. And it's not because they're pedestrian or common. It's because they are literally pedestrians. They walk around the world in sort of this happy way that I admire and I envy, but that wasn't my fate. And I think that what a gift, it was to me, because through my writing, I've met so many people that are just like me. And in some ways, I feel that sense of community. And I think that's important too. Like, you can't have all the people walking around happy all the time. Like, you need other people who, are querying and confused and want to sort of create art that sort of tries to sort of get at the meaning of their experiences.
Thank you, Victoria. We're so grateful for your insights and that you came on today. So we so appreciate it.
Thank you. It was nice talking to you.
Well, we're making it easy for ourselves here by doing the same closing for all 4 of these August episodes. So thank you for listening this time. And if you're a regular listener and it's mid-August, you can toggle off the show now. But truly, we thank you. We wish you a happy August. We welcome you checking out Memoir Nation and our upcoming offerings. And between now and the end of the year, you're going to see some pretty transformational stuff going on. We are launching some new community features, and we are getting prepared to offer some writing challenges. Super excited about that. So if you're not already signed up, please do check out Memoir Nation. Start at the free level, and at least you'll get updates about what's coming up so you can opt into things as you want to. Or, of course, we want you to sign up for a membership. Either way, we just want to stay connected here in your inbox and on the podcast. So thank you all for making Memoir Nation possible, and until next week.